Good afternoon. I'm Dr. Agatha Caraballo, and I have the privilege of serving as the director of the Maurice A. Ferré Institute for Civic Leadership in the Stephen J. Green School of International and Public Affairs at Florida International University. Thank you for joining us this afternoon for our Civic Leadership and Service series. We're excited to have a conversation with George F. Knox, City Attorney for the City of Miami from 1976 to 1982. The Ferré Institute's Civic Leadership and Service series offers engaging discussions with public service leaders in the areas of civic engagement and leadership, community infrastructure, and social justice. We are proud to be bringing this event program today in partnership with our programming co-sponsors, the FIU College of Law, the FIU Department of Public Policy and Administration, and the African and African Diaspora Studies program in the Stephen J. Green School of International and Public Affairs. Today, George Knox is a conversation that we're going to be having that we're really excited to have, and we're so excited that you can join us. As a respected attorney, business, and community leader, George Knox was instrumental in shaping South Florida's business economic landscape. Both behind the scenes and on the record, Mr. Knox helped establish many of Miami's signature enterprises. He was city attorney for the city of Miami from 1976 to 1982 and was in private practice specializing in public policy and local government operations. He served with Mayor Maurice A during some of Miami's most formative years. Mr. Knox was a visiting faculty member at the FIU College of Law between 2010 and December 2014, teaching courses in negotiation and mediation. He was a member of the faculty at the University of Arkansas School of Law, and he also lectured at the University of Miami School of Law, as well as the School of Business Administration, Nova University Law School, and Florida International University's College of Urban and Public Affairs. Mr. Knox currently maintains a private arbitration and mediation practice that features honest reflection and advanced relationship-based negotiation techniques. These techniques are most effective in matters where disputes involve policy and ideological differences or intense emotional dynamics, or where race, ethnicity, or culture may be factors affecting resolution. His outstanding civic service has won Mr. Knox numerous awards and honors. The George F. Knox Living Legend Award was established at the FIU College of Law in April 2015. Without further ado, welcome Mr. Knox, and please join me in the comments and giving him a warm welcome.
Thank you so much, Dr. Caraballo, and thanks to the Institute for giving me this privilege. Because the sphere and scope of all of our interest is so broad, one of the things that I decided to do that might be most helpful is to sort of narrow the focus of my observations and reflections to the questions of community infrastructure and what I call power and politics. Because the most important aspect, I think, of the art and ability of getting things done is to understand how systems actually work. And as a matter of fact, the more we study systems from a sophisticated perspective, the more we appreciate the fact that there is some semblance of order in terms of the way that organizations function and the basis upon which decisions are made within those organizations. And so that would be, I think, a fruitful exercise in exploring the life and work of Maurice A, at least from a perspective of one who shared his life and work during what Dr. Caraballo calls the most formative years, and some people call the most turbulent years of Miami's history. I came to be involved with the city of Miami in a pretty interesting way. I graduated from the University of Miami Law School in 1973, and I was teaching in the School of Business at the University of Miami. I was teaching undergraduates, and one of my law school classmates informed me that there was a position that was available in the law department of the city of Miami. I had no clue about any aspect of local government or what the city attorney's office did, but the pay sounded good, and I was looking for an opportunity to start my career practicing law. And so I joined the staff at the city of Miami, 14th in seniority among 14 lawyers, first African-American in the office. This was a time when there was an interest in making certain that steps were taken to diversify the workforce. And I stayed there for about a year, and then I decided that I wanted to be a law school teacher, and I took an opportunity to go and teach at the University of Arkansas in 1975. And while I was in Arkansas, the city attorney retired, and there was a vacancy for the position of city attorney. And I was called by one of my friends in Miami who said, "George, maybe you should apply for the position of city attorney." I said, "Wait a minute, I just got out of law school 2 years ago." And they said, "Well, at a city commission meeting, when they were discussing filling the city attorney position, Maurice Ferré, the mayor, called your name. Well, I asked about you." He said, "Where's that young professor that used to work here?" And so that was taken as a signal that there could be some opportunity for me, and I, in fact, applied for the position. I was appointed city attorney in September of 1976, age 32, less than 3 years out of law school, jumped over the 13 people who were ahead of me in seniority in the city attorney's office. And think about the reaction across the board to that decision that was in large part facilitated and implemented by Maurice Ferré during his 3rd year as mayor of the city of Miami. So it's with that background that I'll take you through this adventure that I'm going to.
And I guess for those that aren't really familiar, I had mentioned last year that you were in the book presentation on The Year of Dangerous Days by Nicholas Griffin, but just kind of setting the stage of everything that was going on in Miami during that time.
And I'll set the stage again from these levels, these inner levels, because I think that's one of the things that all of us would enjoy talking about. Maurice Ferré had been mayor for less than 3 years. There were no Black department heads. There were few opportunities for advancement or promotion of Blacks and the growing population of Cubans who were moving to Miami away from the circumstances in Cuba. No women department heads, and there was a civil service system that was designed in order to ensure that there was a maintenance of the status quo. Along with all of these human resource issues, someone described Miami as, and I'm quoting, "a cesspool of incompetence and corruption." And there was a conclusion that elected officials, local elected officials, were not too bright, or a little bit dim-witted. And this was a time in which cities were becoming sophisticated. This is the background, by the way, for the establishment of the home rule policy in Miami-Dade County, where all of a sudden all of the non-incorporated areas and agricultural areas were now the urban center, so to speak, and it was necessary for them to be governed. And the two-tier form of government was formed, where Miami-Dade County was the parent government, if you will, and the 37 municipalities had their own local powers, but at the same time they were subject as to countywide functions to the direction of Miami-Dade County. And so the system of reorganization of government was also based upon the idea that leadership could not be reposed in mayors, and cities shouldn't have too much power because they didn't know what they were doing. And it was in this setting that it was Maurice Ferré, visionary, charming, debonair, inherited wealth, and that's a very important statement, I think, as we go along. Inherited wealth as opposed to being a very, very well-paid executive, because that has to do with philanthropy, that has to do with freedom of choice, that has to do with a number of things where one's wealth or the maintenance of one's wealth is not dependent at all on a boss or a board of directors. The other thing that was constraining Maurice Ferré as he had all of these visions about Miami becoming some kind of a cosmopolitan, modern center of international trade and commerce was the power of the mayor itself. The charter of the city of Miami provided at that time that the mayor presided over meetings of the city commission and signed official documents and proclamations and appeared on behalf of the city of Miami at ceremonial events. And that was the extent of the power. The mayor was simply one entitled only one of 5 votes on the city commission. The other constraint was what we affectionately call the Sunshine Law. This is the open meetings law of the state of Florida that had been adopted in order that government again would be subject to scrutiny primarily by the public, they say. But the fact is that the scrutiny was by the Miami Herald, who some say owned Miami at the time, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes. But what that actually meant was that no act of government could take place discreetly. And that's quite, you can't do business when the business is being conducted on TV. At the same time that Miami was trying to become sophisticated and entrepreneurial. The constraint on open meetings or the enforcement of the open meetings law was so great that even in litigation, to settle a lawsuit, we had to discuss the settlement terms in public. People who sued the city of Miami didn't have to even take depositions because their favorite city commissioner would ask all the questions on the public record for everybody to hear. That would be in a deposition, for example, and there are more stories that we can talk about in a minute. Dr. Caraballo mentioned Nicholas Griffin in his book, The Year of Dangerous Days, and he reinforced this idea about the limitations on the exercise of local government. He said there were 3 centers of power at the time that we were talking about: the city government, county government, and between them there was a lot of tension. And because of that tension, there was something called the non-group. The non-group, as he described it, was a group of the wealthiest and most influential businessmen, and I emphasize businessmen, in Miami. One of those people in the early days was the father of Maurice Ferré, and then Maurice Ferré himself. And he went on, of course, to become the mayor of the city of Miami. I think it's important to know a couple of things. One, Maurice Ferré was never an insider because his father, as an independent, very successful business person who owned a whole lot of downtown Miami, did not have to conform to the wishes, if you will, of the so-called power structure. He was his own, he was kind of a maverick. And so much of the attitude towards Maurice Ferré was reluctant. That's either Joe Ferré's boy or, you know, he won't listen. And he was clearly not a team player according to the composition of leadership at the time when he was the mayor and trying to become progressive and cosmopolitan and modern even. What's interesting is why the non-group got its name. I might say among our friendly audience, there were those of us who were cynical, who called the non-group at that time the 12 white men. And so it was this overarching, powerful, mysterious governing body that was actually, running things in Miami. It was formed by Albert Chapman, who was then the publisher, I believe, or the CEO of the Miami Herald Publishing Company, and Harry Hood Bassett, who was the president or the CEO of the Southeast Bank, which was the biggest bank in town. And they decided that in order for Miami to grow and prosper, there had to be some ordered system of government that wasn't happening as far as the existing government was concerned. It had to be called the non-group because, again, that way you don't have to acknowledge that it exists. And even reporters, for example, couldn't ask questions because they couldn't frame a question in a manner that would penetrate this veil that of non-existence, literal non-existence. And so it was the group, the non-group was formed in 1971. And it was only in 1985, after about 15 years of its existence, that the public even knew that it exists and that the participants acknowledged that there was what Maurice Ferré himself called the shadow government, consisting of the non-group. And so if someone, a reporter would ask Mr. Chapman, for example, who owned the newspaper, well, what about this secret group of businessmen who are affecting policy? And he said, there's no group. And he wasn't lying. And this was a part of it. There was a rumor long before I became affiliated with the non-group, but they said in the early days, they were so consistent that if there was a meeting, for example, it would be, Dr. Nan Caraballo, do you have a non-question for this non-organization? And so the consistency was absolutely perfect. But what was so amazing about the operation of the non-group and its scope of leadership was the way that it was organized, once again. And what would happen would be that the non-group members would penetrate every organization in town. So you would have the same people on the Orange Bowl Committee, on the board of trustees of the University of Miami, on the board of the Southeast Bank, and on the executive committee of the Greater Miami Chamber of Commerce. They meet 5 or 6 times a week in some of the various capacities, but they had complete command of the private sector. And so the effort was, in order to help Miami become sophisticated, then the non-group had to help government do sophisticated things. And this is the way that the Beacon Council got formed. The Beacon Council is an agency of Miami-Dade County, even today funded more than 90% by funds coming from Miami-Dade County, staffed essentially by the private sector. CEO in those days, there's been a great deal of change since then, reported directly to the non-group and ultimately to Mr. Chapman. And so all of the question of economic development was now not in the hands of government anymore. The same was true with the formation of the Greater Miami Convention and Visitors Bureau. Once again, funded by government to take charge of this activity associated with tourism and tourism development, staffed and controlled by the private sector, funded in large part by the private sector. And so smart Maurice Ferré thought about the same idea, and that's how we got the Downtown Development Authority, for example. Another smart thing that Maurice Ferré did in connection with all of these overlapping constraints was to figure out a way to get around. And the way you get around being a weak mayor is to take charge of the entire body. And the way he took charge of the entire body was to have the commissioners agree to carve up the functions of the city. Maurice Ferré was in charge of vision and external affairs and downtown, and another commissioner was in charge of matters pertaining to police and fire. Somebody else was in charge of zoning and land use. Father Theodore Gibson, who was an icon in the Black community, was in charge of those things that pertain to the Black community. Somebody else was in charge. And so the idea was, if the idea emanated from somebody in whose sphere the activity was taking place, everybody voted for it. You vote for mine, I vote for yours. And so what Maurice Ferré walked around with a consensus. And he walked around with 3 votes out of 5 that he could count on, to the point that he could act like he was a strong mayor, that he could go to DC, for example, and apply for grants without the formal approval, without public hearings and all of that, because he knew if he gave his word to the other party, he could keep his word because he essentially controlled the votes. And so that's the first lesson. The first lesson out of all of this is play the hand you're dealt and find a way to operate within the constraint of the rules that are applied to your position. And so he centralized the power to the point that nobody knew anybody had anything to do with the Miami from a leadership perspective but Maurice Ferré, because he was the name and face of the entire community. And the reality was he was 1 out of 5 votes on a subordinate unit of government within Miami-Dade County, but he didn't act like that. And so the other rule of the game is act like you have power, whether you have it or not, and be in a position to deliver as if you do have power. And so the question about our relationship is one that is interesting as well, because under those circumstances, we didn't necessarily know each other, but we had some kind of a kinship that was really transcendental in so many respects. And there were rules of engagement because he was the one who was accountable to the people. And so I had to be limited in the kind of freedom that I could exercise because I was accountable to him in the city commission. And so he told me, and we laughed about it for 30 years afterwards, he told me, George, I'll stand with you and by you for as long as I can. And I understood exactly what that meant. And we could live with that. And so the other thing he did was, and I'm going to rely on your advice because I think you know what you're doing. And so the other way that he gained power on the commission was he got them to adopt a policy that said, City Commission formally acknowledges that it will rely upon the advice of the city attorney. Which means that if I give them advice, then they're going to rely upon it. Now, here's the beauty of Maurice Ferré's thinking. Was on occasion, remember, everything had to be in public, including negotiations about condemnation, property interested in purchasing, all of this kind of stuff. And Maurice Ferré had this vision about a downtown center, down commerce, convention center of activity. And so he knew of a hotel next to some property that he knew he could eventually acquire on behalf of the city. And he negotiated a deal. The property was then the YMCA, I think YWCA, I think it's a hotel now, right next to the night saloon. He wanted to buy it and he wanted to negotiate the sale without the world knowing, because if the marketplace knew, they would certainly outbid the city. And can-do city attorney says, sure, yeah, the Sunshine Law has exceptions, they just weren't published. And so I told them they could meet in secret to do something because it was for the benefit of the public in order that they might be able to do this. And of course, one of the city commissioners who didn't want it to happen alerted the Miami Health, who alerted the state attorney, who then caused me and the whole commission to go to the grand jury And each of the commissioners said, oh no, we rely on the advice of the city attorney. We wouldn't have done it unless he told us it was all right. And then I remember those words, I'll stand with you and by you for as long as I can. But that became a part of the job. And of course, ultimately, there are exceptions to the Sunshine Rule, including matters associated with acquisition of property and so forth. And so this says a lot about how one might describe Maurice Ferré's method of leadership. I call it reverse Machiavellianism. In other words, he took every bad feature of being a prince who rules by tyranny and fear and flipped it. And he became a prince who rules by flattery and charm and understanding how to package things and hemming people in with logic and facts and data. When people were talking about the fact that you couldn't have underground parking, for example, because of the infrastructure and the water and all of that. He went to Venice and found all these underground parking garages and asked the world, well, if they can do it in Venice, why can't we do it here? And so these are the kinds of things that he would find a way to cause people to come around to his way of thinking. The most important aspect of his tenure and the most fulfilling aspect of my tenure as city attorney really had to do with public-private enterprises. And the fact is that he's the father of the public-private partnership that we talk about now. And he had to use what he called synergy and leveraged financing in order to do things like the construction of the Knight Center, for example. The Knight Center is actually the James and John L. Knight City of Miami, University of Miami Conference and Convention Center with a hotel facility. That is the name of it. And it was the most complicated deal, according to the hotel developer, that he had ever been involved in, because all of those pieces had to fit together and all of the financing had to make sense. And the city had to pay for a parking garage, and it had to justify a parking garage based upon a public need that could not by itself be generated by the operation of a conference and convention center. The parking garage that now holds, what is it called? It used to be the SunTrust Tower, now the Miami Tower. The parking garage was built to hold a 30-story building because Ferré came up with the idea, since you gotta have a parking garage, why can't you then build it so that you can grant air rights and gain revenue for the city of Miami? And so it was built in order to hold a 30-story building that didn't come along until later on. So these are just a few. I guess one that I would also have to mention is when Maurice Ferré couldn't get 3 votes, he'd still find another way. When I talked earlier about the segregated workforce and the refusal because of the entrenchment of the civil service system and the status quo, there was no way he could get a 3rd vote in order to implement changes in the human resource system. So Maurice Ferré, as mayor of the city of Miami, went to the United States Department of Justice, made an appointment in the Civil Rights Division, and said, I wish to announce that the city of which I am the mayor is guilty of systemic and systematic racial discrimination in its workforce, and I invite you to please sue us. And that led to now what is now known as the famous 1977 consent decree, which is still in effect, by the way. And so again, in order to get something done, he found a way to finesse the system lawfully, within the parameters, and with integrity. Because again, either you discriminate or you don't, and we'll let a neutral third party decide. And so the court decided that there was discrimination, and the consent decree is responsible for the racial and gender integration of the entire workforce of the city of Miami. So these are a few of the ways in which very important lessons in leadership and civic engagement, I think, can be appreciated. Times have changed now, and one might ask, well, what does that have to do with what we're trying to do now? But I would suggest to you that it's the same thing. Different players, different generation, different circumstances. But the fight about a tunnel is still going on as we talk about what we're going to do about getting access to downtown from Brickell, for example. Questions of doing something about a mass transit system that we used to say goes from nowhere to nowhere in terms of making a modern transportation system. And so the issues are still present, but the solutions are also present as well, using the principles of finding a way to get it done within the parameters. I know you mentioned philanthropy earlier. Now we have to deal with brand new philanthropy, again, from newly independent people who don't have the non-group or leaders of the non-group saying, to write a corporation for the United Way, I need $27,000 from you. Yes, sir. When do you need the check? To a man like George Perez, who makes his own decisions about philanthropy because, again, he's self-made. And so we now have an emerging pillar of the community who's in a very, very strong position in terms of his capacity to use his power and resources in order to effectuate those changes that he thinks are significant without being compelled to do it. And that's a magnificent change. And it is not insignificant that Jorge Perez is from Cuba. And so, again, among the fears you see in 1976 had to do with the integration of cultures in this community that used to be a sleepy little southern town, and all of a sudden it's being inundated again. And not only with Blacks who are making demands, but women who are making demands, people of Hispanic origin who were taking command because of the power that they had economically and politically. And now to see it coming all the way around to the point that the same people that were feared and loathed are now responsible for 2 museums, who are responsible for $33 million being contributed to the Miami Foundation, who are populating the places of leadership, who are emerging into a cohesive community. And we really, honest to God, didn't go to hell as people feared and some predicted. So I'll stop. But, and I'll be glad to elaborate, answer questions, respond to comments, whatever it is that we might be able to do in the time that remains.
Awesome. No, thank you so much. And at this point, I just want to, we also posted in the chat, please feel free to post any questions that you may have in the Q&A, which we'll address. What I found was just so fascinating about all of this is hearing about how you could build consensus while also challenging the status quo. And I remember from one of our earlier conversations, something that you really kind of stuck with me as we think of Miami as a living laboratory, that it was becoming what the rest of the country was reflecting, and that either excited or terrified people.
You know, this is only like we haven't even gotten to 1980 yet. All the stories that I told haven't even gotten to 1980. And of course, 1980 brought the Mariel boat wreck. It brought the McDuffie disturbance. It brought the cocaine cowboys. And all of this was going on at the same time. City manager was, African-American city manager also was hired during Maurice Ferré's tenure. And again, Ferré stuck with him for as long as he could, but there was a time when there were differences that became so pronounced and so public that it was necessary for them to part ways, and Ferré had to find a way to package that in order not to inflame his friends in the Black community. Because I think that that's another ingredient in effective leadership, and that is to know who your constituents are and to have them to trust you and to feel as if you have their interests at heart. And Maurice Ferré was very well known and extraordinarily popular in the Black community because he had Black friends. I mean, really. And these were places where he could go and relax and talk about the real politics and complain about things. And people were loyal to him because if he gave his word, he'd make an effort to keep his word. So all of these things are really important and significant in terms of the capacity to make things work. And so if the Miami Herald opposed the development of a relationship between the private sector and the public sector, but then you tell two icons in the Miami Herald, we're going to name it after you, James L. Knight, John L. Knight conferencing, then it makes a difference in how you think about what you want to oppose. And the other thing is to deliver. Because of the success of the Knight Center, the next thing was to do the waterfront so that we have commercial entertainment venues and profit-making activities taking place on the sacred waterfront. And that happened because, again, of leverage and things that made sense. So what we had to do, redefine public purpose. And so the courts have said a marina is a public purpose, and therefore there can be a marina operated by the private sector on public property, okay? And that marina led to the development of Monty's because of leverage. If you're gonna have a marina, you gotta sell fuel. If you're gonna sell fuel, you might as well sell snacks. If you're gonna sell snacks, you might as well sell nautically related things. Somebody can buy a jacket, somebody can buy a life vest, somebody can, and so since you're gonna have people gathered shopping, then we might as well provide a sit-down restaurant. And so you keep stacking things on top of each other until after a while you have a whole complex. Here's a question that I see. Some argue that Miami evolved from a living laboratory to a solution center. And do I agree? I think so. Again, not by design. People say that Miami achieved this greatness almost either by divine benevolence or by chance, because all of the great things that have happened on behalf of Miami happened as a result of people taking a risk. That is why, again, to go back, that is why Ferré is so revered among people who know and understand how great cities evolved because of the risks that he took without precedent, especially here, against the wills of people who didn't want it to happen that way. And so it was a living laboratory because so many of the things that we did were unprecedented, especially in the South, especially in the South. And the other thing is they came to be prototypes. They came to be prototypes that other local governments would emulate. For better and for worse, because to become a banking center in the 80s wouldn't, might not have been such a great idea because it was such an invitation to those who might want to use the banking system as a dry cleaning establishment. I'll put it that way.
Carlos Ferré also posted in the chat, kind of building off what you just said about looking at other cities to look at and to learn, and now other cities are now looking at us to learn.
Yeah, and here's a question related to that, because the other thing that Maurice did was study other places. Like I said earlier, if you argue that underground parking won't work in Miami because of the water table didn't go to Venice. and if what's the difference between Miami and Baltimore in terms of the kind of development that Bayside became, for example, and what's wrong with making an arena a showplace and a destination, for example. And so the idea of finding what the state of the art is, showing people how it can work to the point that opponents can't argue with the data, the facts, and the logic. And then pulling it off is an amazing gift and attribute that requires, it requires something other than ordinariness in order to do it. Time, place, and circumstances have to coincide. And the ability to touch something inside of others also has to be present as well.
Wonderful. We have a question in the Q&A. It's from Eduardo Lombard. He says, I was a boy, age 13, now 74, always lived in Miami-Dade County. Do you feel the system still perpetuates with subdivided mini municipalities? Same status quo, but a larger system in 2021?
Well, I think so, but things are different now. There's greater power in municipalities now than there was then. Municipalities were weak little service providers, little pothole tenders. And so the explosion that has happened renders municipalities a lot more powerful now. Miami-Dade, nobody else can tell the city of Coral Gables very much. The emergence of Hialeah as a completely virtually self-sufficient municipal entity. We don't even read about Hialeah in the context of what goes on in the county because they have all the resources that they need and a self-sustaining economy. The fact of the new municipalities that have emerged, like Miami Gardens and other new municipalities that bring resources to the larger whole, have made things different. Now everybody has a strong mayor. Mayor Suarez has veto power, for example. Mayor Suarez chooses the so-called chief administrator who reports to the mayor. This wasn't the case in the old days. Maurice Ferré had to find a kindred spirit, get other people to vote for that person, hope that that person held the line according to whatever the grand scheme was, but with no power at all except virtual power. Well, that's a little bit of that Machiavellian stuff, I guess, but.
Another question, in a multicultural community like Miami, what are some of the lessons of leadership to be mindful of, especially when one or more of the past minority or underrepresented now become the majority and at the mantle of institutions of power?
Yeah. Well, again, you know, without being glib, power is power. And what power brings is either respect or challenge. And so as long as people, here we go with Machiavelli again, don't want to challenge power, then they're neutralized in terms of their capacity to deal with it. Or they come to need the resources that the emerging powerful element brings. Another example is the Miami Herald again. When the Hispanic population started to grow, the Herald decided that this was a market for it, but they didn't know how to go about doing it. And so what they did was they said, well, we'll just Hispanicize the Herald. We'll call it El Herald. And that'll just cause the Spanish-speaking population to buy up the Herald and become a brand new market for us. And see, again, the cynics would say, well, El Herald is just like being naive about anything about the culture's preferences. That's like El Farco, El Knifo. All you do is add L and that makes it Spanish. It didn't have anything to do with the programming, the focus, the kinds of things that were covered. And so a newspaper like our Air Las Americas took the Herald to lunch in terms of who the readership was going to be. And that caused the Herald then to look at it, and now it becomes El Nuevo Herald. Okay, so this is not El Herald anymore, it's El Nuevo Herald. This is the new Herald. We know and understand, how to reach the population. So again, when the economy of the Hispanic community became so large that it became a market for the so-called downtown banking community, had to seek out the market. And so between the marketplace and the actual power that people possess to control things, there must be an adaptation. At the same time, there must be what some people call law and order. There must be order. There must be a process by which things get done. And so, Maurice Ferré's prediction that it'll be 75 years or more before there would ever be anything other than a Cuban mayor of the city of Miami based upon the demographics is one of his prophecies that may not come true because of whatever it is that made Daniela Levine Cava a candidate that could get elected countywide in a significantly Hispanic majority population is a powerful sign about adaptation, for example. And so this is what we have to figure out how to contend with, and that is not be threatened by change just because people change. The system is always consistent. And this is the other lesson. It's all the same stuff. It's just a matter of how you put it together. The same techniques that are used to get things done 600 years ago are still being used today by clever people. And so it's a matter that this is a brand new place now. It's just like when a caterpillar literally liquefies. It is no longer a caterpillar. It has no characteristics at all while it's in the chrysalis. Something else emerges. And the minute we try to mess with it, there's a terrible story about somebody who wanted to help a butterfly escape. And that impaired the butterfly's ability to survive because it didn't gain the strength of struggling for its freedom because somebody thought they were helping it. And so this is what's happening here. Change is here. It is no longer happening. It is here. And the thing is, and we can't change where we are right now. And that's not everything that happened then that is appropriate now. And we have to figure a way to get rid of it and to trust the system that is immutable and inevitable in terms of how things get done.
That's awesome. And one thing I know, since we have a lot of students in the audience, and we talked about how you can affect change, any advice to the students on how they can go out and they can make an impact in their communities?
Well, one thing is to be prepared and informed, and pay attention to the new buzzwords. Data collection and all of these things that we now talk about are the ways that people can effectuate change. That's almost easy. There's no piece of information that is not available to someone now. And the other thing is to be committed to it, to understand and appreciate the fact that nobody is going to succeed every time. Going back, one of these leadership characteristics is patience and resilience and a commitment to what you stand for. To go back to Maurice Ferré. Maurice Ferré understood the demographics were changing to the point that he couldn't be perpetual mayor of the city of Miami because the demographics were changing, and quite frankly, because he was not Cuban, he was Puerto Rican. And so, and that caught up with him in 1985, but that didn't stop him. He found another office to run for, and if he found that the demographics were factors in terms of his inability to get elected to public office, then he'll find out where the power is, like the Miami-Dade Expressway Authority, for example. And since his passion was public transportation, where else would you go except to the place where transportation policy was being decided, for example? And so that's the other part of it. And take what you can get and use it to leverage and exploit what you have. And I think most important, don't worry about it if people think you're stupid. Because the stupider you look to them, the easier it is for you to outsmart them. And it never fails. It never, ever, ever, ever fails. And so it's a kind of, I'll put it this way, to be modest in one's pursuit, I'll put it that way. But the whole idea is to, one, play the hand you've been dealt to the very, very best of your ability. Always know you can find a way to get your way without breaking the rules, and don't ever touch the line. Don't ever touch the line. Sometimes you're separated by something that is hard to measure from the line, but you didn't touch it. You know, it's just like these replays in football, when you're out of bounds or not. And I think the other thing is appreciate the value of others. Because all of this, every last bit of the reform started because the powers that be had a question of the capacity, capability, and competence of the powers that were emerging. And to be unaffected by the fact that people underestimate you is the greatest power sometimes that you could possibly have.
No, this has been amazing. Thank you again so much for just this open, engaging conversation that provided so much insight and context into Miami's history and where we are now and the current state of politics and just community relations. I appreciate just the lessons on being fearless, but also very intentional, and welcome, the comments and suggestions. Thank you again to all of our participants who logged in and joined us this afternoon, and thank you for your comments and your questions. I want to take a moment again to acknowledge our event partners for today, the College of Law, the FIU Department of Public Policy and Administration, and the African and African Diaspora Studies Program. To learn more about the Ferré Institute, please join us by visiting ferré.fiu.edu. Oops, let me type that again. And reaching out to us if you have any questions or concerns. We hope that you'll be able to join us for the next installment of the Civic Leadership and Service Series on September 30th at 3 p.m. We'll be joined by Cecil Schoon, who is the president of the League of Women Voters of Florida, as we continue to share engaging conversations and to learn from those who are leading in our communities. Please join me again in just thanking Mr. Knox for his time and for sharing these words of wisdom with us.
And thank you all, especially those who sent notes. I love you all. Thank you so much.
Awesome, thank you. And thank you again for joining us.